Ambassador Zekthara had witnessed the rise and fall of 17 civilizations during her 3 centuries of service to the Galactic Council. She had seen species that could manipulate gravity with thought alone, others that existed as pure energy, and civilizations that had mastered time itself. Yet nothing had prepared her for the moment she first observed humanity preparing for war. The observation deck of the Council battleship Eternal Vigilance hummed with nervous energy as delegates from across the galaxy gathered to witness what many believed would be humanity's final stand. Below them, through the reinforced viewing ports, the human fleet hung in the void like scattered stars against the darkness of space. Such small ships, whispered Council member Vrex, his crystalline form refracting the distant starlight. How do they expect to face the Kethmoran armada with such primitive vessels? Zekthara's tentacles curled thoughtfully as she studied the human formation. The ships were indeed smaller than the massive dreadnoughts favored by most advanced civilizations, but there was something about their arrangement that struck her as deliberately calculated. Each vessel held position with mathematical precision, creating patterns that seemed almost artistic in their complexity. The Kethmoran Empire had been the galaxy's greatest threat for over 2 millennia. Their ships were living constructs, grown rather than built, each one capable of regenerating damage and adapting to enemy tactics in real time. They had conquered 47 star systems in the past century alone, each victory more decisive than the last. Their approach to warfare was methodical, overwhelming, and utterly without mercy. Humanity had only joined the galactic community 73 years ago, emerging from their single world with a hunger for exploration that had impressed even the most jaded council members. They had proven themselves capable diplomats and innovative traders, but their military capabilities remained largely untested. Until now, the Kethmoran Vanguard has entered the system, announced the ship's AI, its voice carrying the weight of inevitability. On the main display, dark shapes began materializing from hyperspace, each one the size of small moon. The bioships pulsed with organic light, their surfaces writhing as if alive. Zekthara had seen these vessels in action before. They moved like predators, surrounding their prey before slowly constricting until nothing remained but debris. The psychological effect was as devastating as their firepower. Many species simply surrendered when they saw the Kethmoran fleet approach. But the humans did something unexpected. Instead of tightening their formation or falling back to defensive positions, they began to spread out even further. Ship after ship broke away from the main group, accelerating toward the edges of the system with what appeared to be reckless abandon. Are they retreating already? Councilor Rex asked, her compound eyes focusing on the tactical display. This is most disappointing. I had hoped they would at least attempt to fight. Zekthara wasn't so certain. She had spent considerable time studying human culture and history during the integration process, and one thing had become abundantly clear. Humans did not retreat easily. In fact, they seemed to possess an almost pathological inability to surrender even in the face of overwhelming odds. The first wave of Kethmoran ships moved into attack formation, their biohulls rippling as weapon ports began to open like flowering mouths. These were the Harvester-class vessels, each one capable of stripping a planet bare within hours. Behind them came the true monsters, the World Enders bioships so massive they generated their own gravitational fields. The human response was immediate and completely unlike anything in the Council's military database. Instead of engaging the Kethmoran ships directly, the human vessels began firing not at their enemies, but at carefully calculated points in empty space. Energy beams and projectile weapons discharged in sequences that seemed random until Zekthara realized she was watching the most complex piece of ballistics she had ever encountered. The projectiles weren't aimed at where the Kethmoran ships were, or even where they would be. They were aimed at where they would be forced to go. Fascinating, she murmured, her analytical mind beginning to grasp the implications. They're not trying to destroy the enemy fleet. They're trying to control it. The Kethmoran ships, following their standard tactics, began to adjust course to avoid the incoming fire. But each evasive maneuver pushed them further into predetermined kill zones. The humans had somehow calculated not just the enemy's position, but their entire decision-making process. Counselor Vrex's form flickered with confusion. This makes no tactical sense. They're wasting ammunition on empty space while the enemy advances unopposed. But Zekthara was beginning to understand. She had read about human military history, about generals who had won battles through pure strategic brilliance rather than superior force. Humans called it thinking outside the box, though she had never fully grasped what that meant until now. The first Kethmoran ship to reach weapons range opened fire, its bioplasma cannons painting space with deadly energy. The targeted human vessel should have been vaporized instantly. Instead, it twisted away at the last possible second, the plasma beam passing harmlessly through space. But not empty space. The beam struck one of the human projectiles that had been fired minutes earlier, detonating it in a brilliant flash that temporarily blinded the Kethmoran ship's sensors. In that moment of confusion, 3 human vessels appeared, as if from nowhere, unleashing a concentrated barrage that penetrated the bioship's defenses and struck its core. The massive creature convulsed once and went dark. A ripple of shock ran through the observation deck. The Kethmoran hadn't lost a ship in combat for over 60 years. How is this possible? Counselor Mrex demanded. Their weapons are barely capable of penetrating Kethmoran armor plating. Zekthara was studying the tactical readouts with growing amazement. They're not using their weapons to penetrate the armor. They're using them to disrupt the bioship's neural pathways. Look at the strike patterns. The display showed the human attack vectors, each one precisely targeted at nerve clusters that most species didn't even know existed in Kethmoran bioships. It was anatomical warfare taken to a level of precision that bordered on artistry. The battle continued to unfold in ways that defied conventional military doctrine. Human ships appeared and disappeared like ghosts, striking at vulnerable points before melting back into the darkness. They used debris fields as cover, turned asteroid fields into weapons, and somehow managed to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment with uncanny consistency. But what truly amazed Zekthara was the level of coordination. There were over 300 human vessels in the engagement, spread across millions of cubic kilometers of space. Yet they moved with the precision of a single organism. No communication lag, no hesitation, no confusion. It was as if they shared a collective consciousness. How are they coordinating so effectively? She asked the observation deck's tactical officer, a young Altarian with expertise in military communications. Unknown, came the reply. We're detecting minimal electromagnetic chatter between their vessels. By all rights, they should be operating virtually blind. That was when Zekthara noticed something that chilled her to the core. The human ships weren't just fighting the Kethmoran. They were learning from them. Each engagement taught them something new about their enemy's capabilities, and that knowledge was being applied instantly across the entire fleet. When one human captain discovered that Kethmoran bioships had a blind spot on their ventral surface, every human vessel in the battle zone immediately began exploiting that weakness. But more disturbing was what happened when the Kethmoran attempted to adapt. The bioships began rotating to eliminate the blind spot, but the humans had already moved on to targeting a completely different vulnerability. It was as if they were always one step ahead, anticipating not just what their enemy was doing, but what they would do next. The turning point came when the Kethmoran world enders entered effective weapons range. These massive bioships were essentially mobile planets, their surfaces bristling with enough firepower to sterilize entire star systems. When they began charging their primary weapons, space itself seemed to tremble. The human response was immediate and terrifying in its simplicity. Every human vessel in the system suddenly accelerated to maximum velocity, converging on a single point directly between the world enders and their target. For a moment, it appeared as though humanity was about to sacrifice its entire fleet in a futile gesture of defiance. Instead, they did something that would be talked about in military academies for centuries to come. At the moment when collisions seemed inevitable, the human ships fired their engines in perfect synchronization, creating a gravitational anomaly that bent space itself. The World Ender's primary weapons discharge, meant to obliterate the human fleet, was deflected back along its original trajectory. The bioships had effectively destroyed themselves. The silence on the observation deck was absolute. Even the ship's AI seemed stunned by what had just occurred. In the span of 47 minutes, humanity had not only defeated the Kethmoran armada, but had done so with minimal losses and tactics that bordered on the impossible. The Kethmoran survivors are requesting permission to withdraw. The the communications officer reported, his voice barely above a whisper. Zekthara watched as the remaining bio ships, their formation shattered and their confidence broken, began the slow process of retreat. The Kethmoran Empire, which had seemed unstoppable just hours before, was fleeing from a species that most of the galaxy still considered to be primitive newcomers. As the human fleet began reforming for pursuit, Zekthara realized she was witnessing something that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a demonstration of capabilities that no one had suspected humans possessed. Ambassador, Counselor Vrex's voice was small and uncertain. What have we just witnessed? Zekthara's tentacles rippled with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The birth of a new kind of warfare, she replied, and possibly the end of the old galaxy as we know it. She turned back to the viewport, watching as human ships continued their relentless advance into the darkness beyond. For the first time in her long career, she found herself wondering not what humanity might become, but whether the rest of the galaxy was ready for what they already were. The implications were staggering. If humans could defeat the Kethmoran with such apparent ease, what other impossible things might they be capable of? More importantly, what would they do with these capabilities? As the Eternal Vigilance prepared to follow the human fleet and document what many suspected would be the final destruction of the Kethmoran Empire, Zekthara made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She would study these humans, learn their methods, and try to understand the force that had just reshaped galactic politics with a single battle. She had no idea that what she had witnessed was merely the beginning. 3 months after the Battle of Kepler's Edge, Ambassador Zekthara found herself standing in the command center of the human vessel Indomitable Spirit, watching Captain Sarah Chun coordinate what the humans called a liberation operation. The target was Vorthak Prime, the heavily fortified capital of a Kethmoran puppet state that had been enslaving entire populations for resource extraction. The transformation in human military doctrine since their first engagement had been remarkable to witness. What had begun as an impressive but isolated victory had evolved into something far more systematic and terrifying. The humans hadn't just defeated the Kethmoran armada. They had absorbed its lessons and built upon them with a creativity that defied conventional understanding. Displacement charges are in position, reported Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez from his station. Target infrastructure has been mapped to 97% accuracy. Captain Chin nodded, her attention focused on the holographic display showing Vorthak Prime's defensive grid. The planet was a fortress world, its surface protected by energy shields and orbital defense platforms that had repelled every liberation attempt for over 40 years. The Galactic Council had classified it as impregnable. Zekthara had requested permission to observe this operation specifically because she wanted to understand how humans approach problems that other species considered unsolvable. The answer, she was learning, lay in their fundamental refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible. "Ma'am," called Ensign Park from the communications station, "we're receiving surrender offers from 3 of the orbital platforms. They're willing to discuss terms." "Acknowledged," Chin replied without taking her eyes off the tactical display. "Inform them that surrender will be accepted after the civilian population has been secured, not before." It was a typically human response, Zekthara reflected. Most species would have accepted the surrender immediately, grateful to reduce casualties and complications. Humans seem to operate from a different moral framework entirely, one that prioritized the protection of the innocent above tactical convenience. The operation began with characteristic human precision. Instead of the massive frontal assault that most military doctrines would demand, the human fleet split into dozens of smaller groups, each one targeting a specific aspect of the planet's defenses. Some engaged the orbital platforms directly, while others deployed what the humans called surgical strikes against carefully selected ground targets. But what truly amazed Zekthara was the level of detailed intelligence the humans possessed about conditions on the planet's surface. They knew the locations of every slave camp, every processing facility, every defensive position. More importantly, they seemed to understand the psychological profile of every defender. "How did you acquire such detailed information?" she asked Captain Chun during a brief lull in the action. The human commander glanced at her with what Zekthara had learned to recognize as mild amusement. "We asked the people who live there. But Vorthak Prime has been under communications blackout for decades." "How could you possibly, Ambassador?" Chun interrupted gently. One thing you need to understand about humans is that we're very good at talking to people who aren't supposed to be talking to us. The implications of that statement were staggering. It meant that humans had somehow established contact with resistance movements on occupied worlds throughout Kethmoran space, creating an intelligence network that spanned hundreds of star systems. The organizational challenge alone should have been impossible for a species that had only been part of galactic civilization for 7 decades. The first phase of the assault targeted the planet's communications array, but not in the way Zekthara expected. Instead of destroying the equipment, human engineers somehow took control of it, broadcasting what they called liberation frequencies across the entire planet. Within minutes, the communications channels were filled with messages of hope and instruction, coordinating resistance activities that had apparently been planned for months in advance. Sector 7 reporting successful uprising came a transmission from the planet's surface. Slave Processing Facility Alpha 7 is under our control. Beginning evacuation procedures. Confirmed, Sector 7, responded Chun. Medical support is en route. Hold position until relieved. Zekthara realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic military history. This wasn't just an invasion. It was a coordinated revolution being directed from space with the participation of the planet's own population. The humans had somehow turned the Defenders' greatest strength, their intimate knowledge of the terrain, into their greatest weakness by recruiting the very people they were oppressing. The orbital battle proceeded with the methodical efficiency she had come to associate with human military operations. The defensive platforms, designed to repel massive assault fleets, were simply not equipped to deal with the swarm tactics that humans employed. Small, fast ships darted between the platforms like insects, striking at critical systems before disappearing into the darkness. But what impressed Zekthara most was the restraint. Despite possessing overwhelming firepower advantages, the humans carefully avoided any action that might harm civilian populations. She watched as attack runs were aborted at the last second because new intelligence revealed the presence of non-combatants, and saw human pilots risk their own lives to prevent collateral damage. Captain, called the tactical officer, we've identified the main slave processing center. Intelligence confirms over 10,000 civilians are being held there. Chen's expression hardened. What are the defensive capabilities? Heavy shielding, automated defense turrets, and approximately 500 Vorthack military personnel. Standard Doctrine would recommend orbital bombardment, followed by ground assault. Standard Doctrine is written by people who've never had to explain to a child why their parents aren't coming home, Chen replied. What's the creative solution? The question seemed to energize the entire bridge crew. Zekthara watched as human officers began proposing ideas that ranged from the merely unconventional to the apparently impossible. What emerged was a plan that was so audacious, she initially dismissed it as fantasy. They were going to steal the entire facility. The operation required precise coordination between 12 different human vessels, each one equipped with specialized equipment that Zekthara didn't even recognize. The first step involved creating a localized distortion in the planet's gravitational field, something that should have required massive installations rather than ship-mounted devices. Gravity anchors in position, reported the engineering station. Spatial distortion field is stable and holding. The next phase involved something the humans called selective phase shifting. Zekthara watched in amazement as the entire slave processing facility simply began to fade from the planet's surface, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. Transport successful, announced the tactical officer. Facility and all occupants are secured in Cargo Bay 7. Medical teams are standing by. They had somehow moved an entire building, along with everyone inside it, from the planet's surface to their ship without anyone experiencing so much as a moment of discomfort. The technology involved was so far beyond what Zekthara understood to be possible that she wondered if she was hallucinating. How? She managed to ask. Physics is more flexible than most people assume, Chen replied with characteristic human understatement. You just have to know which rules you can bend and which ones you really can't break. The liberation of Vorthack Prime continued for 6 more hours, but the outcome was never in doubt. The combination of superior technology, innovative tactics, and local support made human victory inevitable. What surprised Zekthara was the aftermath. Instead of claiming the planet for themselves or installing a human government, The Liberation Fleet simply withdrew once the last Kethmoran collaborator had been captured. They left behind medical supplies, communication equipment, and detailed instructions for establishing a democratic government, but no permanent human presence. "You're not staying?" Zekthara asked as the fleet prepared to depart. "Why would we?" Chun seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "It's their planet. They should be the ones to decide how to run it." This, perhaps more than any display of military prowess, demonstrated the fundamental difference between humans and every other spacefaring species Zekthara had encountered. Most civilizations conquer to expand their territory or resources. Humans seem to fight primarily to give others the freedom to make their own choices. As the indomitable spirit jumped to hyperspace, beginning the journey to their next target, Zekthara found herself reviewing the tactical recordings of the operation. The more she studied human methods, the more she realized she was looking at a completely new form of warfare, one that combined technological innovation with psychological insight in ways that seemed almost supernatural. But it was the conversation she overheard between two junior officers that truly chilled her. "Did you see the look on the Vorthaki defense commander's face when we phased his prison out from under him?" asked Ensign Martinez. "Yeah," replied Petty Officer Kim. Same expression the Kethmoran admiral had at Kepler's Edge. "Pure terror." "Good," Martinez said quietly. "Maybe word will get around, and the next bunch will surrender without a fight." "Doubt it." Kim shook her head. "These Empire types never learn until it's too late. They can't imagine that anyone could be better at war than they are." "Their loss," Martinez shrugged. Literally, the casual confidence in their voices was more intimidating than any display of weapons could have been. These weren't soldiers drunk on victory. They were professionals who had already calculated the eventual outcome of the war and were simply proceeding through the necessary steps to achieve it. Zekthara realized that what she was witnessing wasn't just the liberation of individual planets, but the systematic dismantling of an empire that had dominated this region of space for over 2,000 years. The Kethmoran Empire was being defeated not through conquest or negotiation, but through the simple process of making their continued existence impossible. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated itself across dozens of star systems. Human fleets would appear, often without warning, and within hours entire planetary governments would collapse. Sometimes there was fighting, sometimes there wasn't, but the outcome was always the same. Populations that had been enslaved for generations suddenly found themselves free, and their former oppressors either fled or were captured to stand trial for their crimes. The speed of the advance was breathtaking. Systems that the Galactic Council had spent decades trying to liberate through diplomatic means were freed in a matter of days. The Kethmoran Empire, which had seemed like an eternal fixture of galactic politics, was dissolving like smoke in a strong wind. But Zekthara was beginning to understand that the military campaign was only the visible part of something much larger. The humans weren't just fighting a war. They were engineering a complete transformation of galactic civilization. Every freed world received not just liberation, but a comprehensive package of technology, education, and institutional support designed to ensure they would never be vulnerable to conquest again. As she prepared her reports for the Galactic Council, Zekthara struggled to find words that would convey the magnitude of what she was witnessing. How could she explain to leaders who thought in terms of centuries that humans operated on timescales that made their most ambitious plans seem glacial by comparison? More importantly, how could she make them understand that the galaxy they had known for millennia was coming to an end, and that the creatures responsible for this transformation were just getting started? 6 months into what historians would later call the Liberation War, Ambassador Zekthara received an invitation that changed her understanding of humanity forever. Admiral Marcus Webb, commander of the 3rd Liberation Fleet, had requested her presence aboard the flagship Prometheus Rising for what he termed a demonstration of human engineering capabilities. The invitation was unusual for several reasons, not least of which was that humans rarely revealed their technological capabilities to outside observers without specific purpose. Zekthara had learned to approach such invitations with a mixture of curiosity and caution, knowing that what humans considered demonstrations often redefined the boundaries of what other species believed possible. She materialized on the Prometheus Rising's main deck via quantum teleporter, a technology that humans had somehow perfected despite having no theoretical framework for its operation according to established galactic science. Admiral Webb was waiting for her, a tall man with graying hair and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of profound responsibility. Ambassador. He greeted her with a formal courtesy that characterized human diplomatic interactions. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I believe you'll find today's operation particularly illuminating. The flagship was unlike any human vessel Zekthera had previously observed. Where other ships in the Liberation Fleet were sleek instruments of precision warfare, the Prometheus Rising was something altogether different. The corridors seemed to shift subtly as she walked through them, and she noticed that the ship's internal geometry didn't quite match what should have been possible given its external dimensions. Admiral, she ventured as they walked toward what she assumed was the bridge. This vessel seems to employ spatial distortion technology on a scale I hadn't thought possible. Webb nodded, his expression suggesting both pride and something approaching regret. The Prometheus Rising is what we call a world ship, though that term doesn't really do it justice. She's more accurately described as a mobile manufacturing and research facility capable of producing everything from quantum computers to artificial ecosystems. They entered what Webb called the Primary Coordination Center, and Zekthera felt her understanding of space-based engineering undergo another fundamental revision. The chamber was vast beyond what the ship's exterior suggested, filled with holographic displays that showed everything from individual molecular structures to galactic-scale tactical projections. We're currently approaching the nexus of Kareth, Webb explained, indicating a massive structure visible through the chamber's transparent aluminum viewing ports. Former Kethmoran Fortress and Administrative Center for 17 star systems. Current population, approximately 40 million beings of various species, most held in various forms of bondage. Zekthera studied the structure with growing amazement. The Nexus of Kareth was legendary throughout the galaxy, a space station the size of a small moon that had been constructed over centuries by forced labor. It was considered absolutely impregnable, its defenses having defeated every liberation attempt for over 300 years. Admiral, she said carefully, the Nexus has withstood siege by entire galactic battle fleets. How do you propose to liberate it without massive casualties? Webb's smile was enigmatic. We don't propose to liberate it, Ambassador. We're going to give it the opportunity to liberate itself. The operation began with what appeared to be a standard human approach. Small, fast vessels approached the Nexus from multiple vectors while maintaining careful distances from the station's defensive systems. But, as Zekthera watched the tactical displays, she realized that the ships weren't preparing for an assault. They were deploying something into the void around the station. Deployment successful, reported Captain Martinez from her position at the tactical station. Nanite Cloud is achieving optimal dispersion. Nanites? Zekthera asked, her voice sharp with concern. Admiral, nanite weapons are prohibited under 17 different galactic treaties. These aren't weapons, Webb replied calmly. They're teachers. The explanation that followed challenged every assumption Zekthera had made about the limits of human technology. The nanites weren't designed to damage or destroy anything. Instead, they were microscopic libraries, each one containing compressed information about everything from basic civil rights to advanced democratic governance. More importantly, they were designed to interface directly with the neural systems of any species they encountered. You're going to educate the entire population of the Nexus simultaneously, Zekthera breathed, the implications staggering her. Education is liberation, Webb said simply. But we're doing more than just providing information. We're giving them the tools to understand their situation and make informed choices about their future. The nanite cloud reached the Nexus's outer perimeter and began to infiltrate the station through microscopic gaps in the hull plating. Within minutes, reports began filtering in from across the massive structure. The station's population was receiving a comprehensive education about their rights, their options, and the reality of their situation. But what happened next surprised even Zekthera, who had thought she was becoming accustomed to human innovations. The nanites weren't just providing information. They were facilitating communication between the station's various population groups. For centuries, the Kethmoran had maintained control by keeping different species isolated from each other, unable to coordinate resistance efforts. Now, suddenly, beings who had never been able to communicate were sharing ideas and planning coordinated action. Sector 12, reporting organized resistance, came the first transmission from within the Nexus. Security forces have been neutralized, requesting guidance on liberation protocols. Confirmed, Sector 12, responded Captain Martinez. Liberation protocols are now available through your nanite interfaces. Medical and technical support will be available upon request. Zekthara watched in fascination as similar reports flooded in from across the massive station. The Nexus of Kareth, which had maintained iron control over its population for centuries, was experiencing a simultaneous uprising across its entire structure. More remarkably, the uprising was proceeding with minimal violence and maximum efficiency. How is this possible? She asked. Revolutions are chaotic by nature. This level of coordination should be impossible. Only if you assume that revolution requires ignorance, Webb replied. Give people accurate information about their situation and clear options for improving it, and they'll make remarkably sensible choices. The chaos usually comes from uncertainty and fear, not from the desire for freedom itself. The liberation of the Nexus proceeded with clockwork precision. Security forces vastly outnumbered and, suddenly, facing a population that understood both their rights and their tactical options, surrendered en masse. Administrative personnel, realizing that their continued employment depended on the consent of the governed, offered their services to the emerging provisional government. Within 6 hours, the Nexus of Kareth had transformed from an impregnable fortress of oppression into a beacon of hope broadcasting liberation protocols to 17 star systems. But Admiral Webb wasn't finished. Phase 2, he announced to the bridge crew. Structural reconfiguration. Zekthara watched in growing amazement as the Prometheus Rising deployed what appeared to be construction equipment on a scale she had never imagined possible. Massive fabrication units materialized in space around the Nexus, each one the size of a battleship, and humming with energies that made her instruments' readings fluctuate wildly. What are you doing? She asked. The Nexus was designed to facilitate oppression, Webb explained. Its entire structure reflects the need to control and dominate its population. That's not conducive to democratic self-governance. So we're going to change it. What followed was perhaps the most audacious engineering project Zekthara had ever witnessed. The fabrication units began to systematically rebuild the Nexus from the inside out, not destroying its existing structure, but transforming it into something entirely different. Prison cells became community centers. Administrative centers were converted into schools and hospitals. The entire fortress was being reborn as a space-based city designed to celebrate diversity rather than suppress it. The process should have taken years, even with the most advanced technology. Instead, it was completed in 18 hours. How? Zekthara managed to ask as she watched the transformed Nexus begin broadcasting messages of hope across the surrounding star systems. Matter compilation technology, Webb said, as if that explained everything. We've learned to manipulate matter at the quantum level, essentially rewriting the basic structure of materials to serve new purposes. It's environmentally friendly, highly efficient, and has the added benefit of being completely reversible if the population decides they want different arrangements. The implications were staggering. If humans could rebuild a fortress the size of Small Moon in less than a day, what couldn't they accomplish? More importantly, what did this mean for the balance of power in the galaxy? As if reading her thoughts, Webb continued. This is why we invited you to observe, Ambassador. Your people need to understand that we're not trying to conquer the galaxy or replace one empire with another. We're trying to make empires impossible. By removing the technological advantages that make oppression feasible, Zekthara said, her analytical mind grasping the implications. Exactly. When every community has access to advanced manufacturing, communication, and defensive technologies, the old models of centralized control become obsolete. You can't rule people who don't need you. The transformed Nexus was already demonstrating this principle in action. The station's population had organized itself into a confederation of autonomous districts, each one specializing in different aspects of education, research, or manufacturing. They were already sharing their newfound knowledge with the surrounding star systems, creating a network of free communities that would be virtually impossible to reconquer. But what truly amazed Zekthara was the speed with which this transformation had occurred. In less than 24 hours, a symbol of oppression that had dominated this region of space for centuries had become a catalyst for liberation across 17 star systems. The Kethmoran Empire is reporting complete withdrawal from the Kareth sector, reported the communications officer. They're requesting a ceasefire and formal negotiations. Webb nodded, but his expression remained serious. Inform them that we'll be happy to discuss terms once they've released all remaining slave populations and submitted to war crimes tribunals. Sir, they're unlikely to accept those conditions. Then, they'll continue to lose territory until they do, Webb replied matter-of-factly. We have 400 more operations planned for the next 6 months, and the rate is accelerating as liberated populations join the effort. Zekthara realized she was witnessing the death of an empire in real time. The Keth Moran, who had seemed unstoppable just months before, were being systematically dismantled by an opponent they had completely failed to understand. But, more than that, she was witnessing the birth of something entirely new in galactic history, a form of civilization that made traditional concepts of empire and conquest completely obsolete. The humans weren't just defeating their enemies. They were making it impossible for such enemies to exist. As the Prometheus Rising prepared to depart for its next target, Zekthara found herself struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the changes she had witnessed. How could she explain to the Galactic Council that everything they thought they knew about politics, warfare, and civilization was about to become ancient history? More troubling still was the realization that humanity was apparently just getting started. If they could transform something like the Nexus of Kareth in a single day, what would the galaxy look like in a year? In a decade? The answer to that question would soon become terrifyingly clear. 1 year after the first human vessel had entered Kethmoran space, Ambassador Zekthara stood in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council, preparing to deliver a report that would forever change how the galaxy understood the nature of power itself. Around her, representatives from 3,000 civilizations waited in nervous silence, each one grappling with reports that seemed to defy rational explanation. The Kethmoran Empire was gone. Not defeated, not conquered, not collapsed through internal strife, but simply gone. In 12 months, a galactic power that had dominated local space for over 2 millennia had been so thoroughly dismantled that historians were already struggling to explain how it had ever existed in the first place. But that wasn't the most disturbing part of Zekthara's report. The most disturbing part was what had replaced the Empire. Esteemed colleagues, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. I have spent the past year observing humanity's military capabilities firsthand. What I have witnessed challenges not only our understanding of warfare, but our fundamental assumptions about the nature of civilization itself. The holographic display behind her activated, showing a real-time map of what had once been Kethmoran space. Instead of the rigid hierarchy of imperial control that had characterized the region for centuries, the map now showed thousands of independent communities, each one connected to the others through networks of trade, communication, and mutual assistance. In the span of 12 months, Zekthara continued, humanity has liberated over 800 star systems, freed approximately 40 billion beings from various forms of bondage, and established what they call the cooperative networks, a form of interstellar organization that operates without central authority, standing armies, or traditional governmental structures. A ripple of concerned murmurs ran through the assembly. The idea of interstellar civilization without centralized control was so foreign to most galactic cultures that many representatives struggled to even comprehend what Zekthara was describing. Council Speaker Vorth raised his massive form from the central platform. Ambassador, surely you're not suggesting that these networks operate without any form of governance or military protection. That would be anarchy on a galactic scale. With respect, Speaker Vorth, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. But it's not anarchy as we understand the term. It's something entirely new. The holographic display shifted, showing detailed organizational charts that resembled biological networks more than governmental structures. Each community maintains complete autonomy while participating in voluntary associations based on shared interests and mutual benefit. Disputes are resolved through mediation rather than force. Security is provided through collective defense agreements that activate only when member communities are threatened by external aggression. Representative Merlax of the Centauri Confederation leaned forward, his crystalline form refracting the chamber's lights. Ambassador, you're describing a fantasy. No interstellar civilization can maintain cohesion without centralized military command and administrative oversight. The logistical challenges alone would be insurmountable. Zekthara had anticipated this objection. That would be true using conventional organizational models. But humanity has developed what they call distributed intelligence networks, communication, and coordination systems that allow millions of communities to share information and coordinate action without centralized command structures. The holographic display shifted again, this time showing the real-time data flows that connected the liberated communities. The complexity was staggering, billions of information exchanges occurring every second, creating patterns of coordination that resembled the neural networks of a vast galactic brain. How is such coordination possible? Asked Councilmember Zex, her tentacles coiling with nervous energy. The communication delays alone should make real-time coordination across such distances impossible. Humans have developed faster-than-light communication technology based on quantum entanglement principles, Zekthara explained. But more than that, they've created artificial intelligence systems that can predict and respond to changing conditions faster than biological minds can process information. Each community has access to computational resources that exceed the total processing power of most galactic civilizations. The implications of this revelation sent another wave of concerned discussion through the assembly. If humanity had solved the fundamental problems of interstellar communication and coordination, the traditional barriers to galactic-scale organization had essentially ceased to exist. But Representative Korth of the Andromedan Alliance raised what many considered the most important question. Ambassador, what are humanity's intentions regarding the rest of galactic civilization? Do they plan to impose this cooperative network model on other regions of space? Zekthara paused, considering how to explain what she had learned about human motivation during her year of observation. That question reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about how humans approach interstellar relations. They don't impose anything on anyone. In fact, their entire philosophy seems based on the principle that any sustainable civilization must be built on voluntary participation rather than coercive force. She activated another holographic display, this one showing the current military deployment of human forces. What it revealed surprised many representatives. Humanity's fleet was actually smaller now than it had been at the beginning of the Liberation War. As each star system achieves stability and self-governance, human military presence is withdrawn. They provide technological assistance, educational resources, and access to their communication networks, but they don't maintain permanent bases or administrative oversight. The liberated communities are genuinely autonomous. Speaker Vorth's massive head tilted in confusion. But surely they maintain some form of tribute or resource extraction agreements. No civilization fights wars purely for altruistic purposes. That's where you're wrong, Speaker Vorth. Human civilization appears to operate on completely different economic principles than anything we've previously encountered. Zekthara's display shifted to show resource flows within the cooperative networks. Rather than extracting wealth from liberated territories, humanity provides more resources than it receives. They've solved the fundamental problem of scarcity through advanced manufacturing technology that can produce virtually anything from basic raw materials. The chamber fell silent as representatives struggled to process this information. A civilization that could produce unlimited resources had no need to conquer others for economic gain. But if humans weren't motivated by wealth or territory, what drove their expansion across the galaxy? As if anticipating this question, Zekthara continued. Human motivation appears to be based on what they call actualization potential, the belief that every intelligent being should have the opportunity to reach their fullest possible development. They fight not to gain anything for themselves, but to ensure that others have the freedom to grow and create. Representative Claxon of the Spiral Trade Confederation stood, his metallic form gleaming under the assembly's lights. Ambassador, you're describing beings who act contrary to every principle of rational self-interest. Such behavior is evolutionarily impossible. All intelligent species prioritize their own survival and advancement above other considerations. Zekthara had wrestled with this exact question for months. Representative Claxon, I believe we may be witnessing the emergence of what humans call post-scarcity consciousness, a form of intelligence that develops when a species solves all fundamental survival challenges and begins to operate from different motivational frameworks. The holographic display shifted once more, showing comparative analyses of human behavior versus traditional galactic civilizations. The differences were stark. Where most species prioritized resource accumulation and territorial expansion, humans seemed focused on complexity creation and diversity enhancement. They don't want to rule the galaxy, Zekthara explained. They want to help it evolve. This statement triggered the most intense debate of Zekthara's career. Representatives argued, questioned, and demanded additional evidence for hours. Some refused to believe that any species could operate from such seemingly irrational motives. Others worried that humanity's apparent benevolence might be a mask for more sinister long-term intentions. But gradually, as Zekthara presented more evidence of human behavior patterns, a different picture began to emerge. Humanity wasn't following the traditional patterns of galactic conquest because they had transcended the conditions that made such patterns necessary. They had achieved a level of technological and social development that made most forms of interstellar competition obsolete. As the debate continued, reports began filtering into the assembly from across the galaxy. Human exploration fleets had been spotted in 17 different sectors, always following the same pattern. Identify populations living under oppressive conditions, offer assistance in achieving freedom and self-governance, provide technological and educational resources, then withdraw once stability was achieved. They're not building an empire, realized Representative Merlax, his crystalline form flickering with new understanding. They're teaching the galaxy how to eliminate the need for empires. Speaker Vorth raised his massive head, addressing the assembly with uncharacteristic gravity. If Ambassador Zekthara's analysis is correct, we are witnessing the emergence of a force that could fundamentally alter the structure of galactic civilization. The question before us is, how do we respond to beings who appear to possess both the capability and the intention to remake the galaxy according to their vision of optimal organization? The silence that followed this question was profound. For the first time in the Galactic Council's history, its members were confronting the possibility that their entire system of interstellar relations might become obsolete not through conquest or collapse, but through transformation into something they didn't yet understand. Zekthara looked around the assembly, seeing fear, confusion, and uncertainty in the faces of beings who had spent their careers mastering the complexities of traditional galactic politics. None of them had been prepared for contact with a civilization that operated outside the established patterns of power and control. Colleagues, she said finally, I believe we have three options. We can attempt to resist human expansion through military force. Though, given their demonstrated capabilities, this would likely result in our own destruction. We can attempt to maintain our current systems in regions they haven't yet reached, essentially hoping they'll leave us alone. Or we can try to understand what they're offering and decide whether it represents an improvement over our current arrangements. The debate that followed this statement would continue for weeks, but Zekthara already knew what the outcome would be. Throughout the galaxy, populations were beginning to learn about the freedoms enjoyed by communities within the cooperative networks. The old systems of hierarchical control were becoming harder to maintain as people began to question why they should accept limitations that no longer seemed necessary. Humanity hadn't conquered the galaxy through force. They had made the old way of organizing civilization obsolete simply by demonstrating that better alternatives were possible. And they were just getting started. 5 years after first witnessing humanity advance into battle, Ambassador Zekthara found herself standing in the observation deck of the research vessel Infinite Possibility, watching as human engineers prepared to attempt something that even she had initially dismissed as impossible: the reconstruction of an entire dead solar system. The Terminus Reach had been a thriving system of 12 inhabited worlds before the Devourer Wars, 3 centuries ago. An ancient artificial intelligence had consumed everything: planets, stars, asteroids, even the interstellar dust, leaving nothing behind but empty space and quantum echoes of what had once been. It was considered the galaxy's greatest monument to the destructive potential of uncontrolled technology. Now, humanity proposed to undo 3 centuries of absolute devastation and restore the system to its former state. The quantum archaeology phase is complete, reported Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead scientist on what humanity called the Terminus Restoration Project. We've successfully mapped the quantum impressions of every particle that existed in the system prior to the Devourer event. Zekthara studied the holographic displays surrounding the research team, each one showing incomprehensibly complex patterns of data that somehow contain the complete molecular history of an entire solar system. The technology required to detect and analyze quantum impressions at such a scale should have been theoretically impossible. Yet here it was working with characteristic human efficiency. Dr. Vasquez, she ventured. Even if you can map what existed here, how do you propose to actually recreate it? You're talking about rebuilding planets, restarting a star, resurrecting entire ecosystems. That's not engineering. That's approaching the level of cosmic creation itself. The human scientists smiled with a mixture of confidence and humility that Zekthara had learned to associate with humanity's most audacious undertakings. Ambassador, we're not creating anything new. We're simply returning the local space-time to its previous configuration. Think of it as the ultimate recycling project. Around them, the infinite possibility hummed with energies that made Zekthara's instruments fluctuate wildly. The vessel itself was another example of humanity's inexplicable technological capabilities, a ship that existed partially outside normal space-time, allowing it to manipulate reality on scales that should have required the resources of entire galactic civilizations. The restoration process began with what Dr. Vasquez called quantum seed deployment. Thousands of devices, each one smaller than a grain of sand, were released into the empty space where the terminus system had once existed. But these weren't ordinary machines. They were what humans termed reality anchors, devices capable of imposing specific quantum states on the surrounding space-time. Initialization successful, reported the lead engineer, Commander Park. Quantum seeds are establishing probability matrices, beginning temporal reversal sequence. What happened next challenged every law of physics that Zekthara thought she understood. The empty space around them began to shimmer with possibilities, as if reality itself was deciding what it wanted to become. Gradually, patterns began to emerge. The ghost-like outlines of planets, the faint glow of a reconstructing star, the delicate tracery of asteroid belts reforming from quantum memory. How is this possible? Zekthara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matter and energy are just different expressions of information, Dr. Vasquez explained, her attention focused on the readouts flowing across her displays. Once you understand the informational structure of a system, you can recreate it by imposing the correct quantum boundary conditions on local spacetime. The process continued for days, with Zekthara watching in growing amazement as an entire solar system gradually materialized from nothingness. But what truly astounded her was the level of detail in the reconstruction. This wasn't just the creation of generic planets and star systems. Humanity was restoring the terminus reach exactly as it had existed before the Devourer event. The fourth planet is showing atmospheric composition consistent with pre-Devourer readings, reported one of the monitoring technicians. Oceanic systems are forming according to historical models. Early biosignatures are already detectable. They're not just rebuilding the planets, Zekthara realized. They're resurrecting the entire biosphere. Of course, Dr. Vasquez replied matter-of-factly. What will be the point of recreating a dead system? We're restoring everything. The ecosystems, the civilizations, even the individual beings who lived here before the Devourer consumed them. The implications of that statement hit Zekthara like a physical blow. You're bringing back the dead? That's not reconstruction. That's resurrection on a scale that approaches. She struggled to find words adequate to the concept. Divine intervention, Dr. Vasquez suggested with characteristic human directness. We prefer to think of it as advanced problem-solving. Death is just another form of information loss, and information can be recovered if you know where to look and have the right tools. As the restoration continued, Zekthara began to understand that she was witnessing something that transcended even humanity's previous demonstrations of impossible capability. This wasn't just advanced technology, it was a fundamental redefinition of what technology could accomplish. Humans had apparently learned to manipulate the basic structure of reality itself, treating the laws of physics as suggestions rather than absolute constraints. The first sign of life appeared on the restored fourth planet 18 hours after the reconstruction began. Monitoring stations detected the quantum signatures of consciousness, billions of individual minds awakening from a 300-year sleep, completely unaware that they had ever died. The Zephyrian civilization is resuming normal activities, reported the communications officer. They appear to have no memory of the Devourer event. As far as they're concerned, no time has passed. This raised philosophical questions that Zekthara found deeply troubling. If humanity could reverse death itself, What did that mean for the fundamental nature of existence? Were these truly the same beings who had died 3 centuries ago? Or were they perfect copies created from quantum memory? Does it matter? Dr. Vasquez asked when Zekthara voiced her concerns. They have the same memories, the same personalities, the same relationships with each other. From their perspective, they never stopped existing. Isn't that what matters? As the days passed, and the Terminus Reach continued its return to life, Zekthara found herself grappling with questions that went to the heart of what it meant to be alive in a universe where death had apparently become optional. The restored civilizations were flourishing, advancing their societies, creating art and literature and music as if the Devourer Wars had never happened. But perhaps more disturbing was the realization of what this capability meant for humanity's role in the galaxy. If they could undo death itself, reverse the effects of cosmic catastrophes, and restore entire civilizations from quantum memory, then what couldn't they accomplish? Dr. Vasquez, she asked during one of their conversations, why did humanity choose to restore this particular system? There are thousands of dead worlds throughout the galaxy. Why start here? The human scientist was quiet for a moment, studying the displays showing the thriving civilizations of the restored Terminus Reach. Because it was possible, she said finally, because these beings deserved a chance to continue their story. Because the universe is better with diversity than without it. And because, added Commander Parr from his position at the engineering station, we wanted to see if we could do it. Humans have always been driven to push beyond the boundaries of what others consider possible. The final phase of the restoration involved what humanity called temporal integration, the process of ensuring that the restored system would remain stable and self-sustaining. This required delicate adjustments to the quantum foundations of local space-time, essentially programming reality to maintain the new configuration indefinitely. Integration successful, Dr. Vasquez announced as the last of the quantum stabilizers activated. The Terminus Reach is now fully restored and operating independently. The civilizations will continue to develop naturally from this point forward, as the infinite possibility prepared to depart. Leaving the restored system to its own devices, Zekthara reflected on what she had witnessed. In 5 years, she had seen humanity defeat seemingly invincible enemies, transform galactic civilization, and now reverse death itself. Each demonstration had expanded her understanding of what was possible, yet she suspected she had still only glimpsed the surface of human capabilities. What's next? She asked Dr. Vasquez as they watched the Terminus Reach recede into the distance. There's a galaxy full of problems that need solving, the human scientist replied. Dead systems to restore, oppressed populations to liberate, new forms of life to nurture into existence. The universe is vast, and there's so much work to be done. And you believe you can solve all of these problems? Dr. Vasquez smiled, and in that expression Zekthara saw something that was both deeply human and utterly transcendent, a combination of humility and unlimited ambition that characterized the species that had reshaped her understanding of what intelligence could accomplish. We could try, she said simply. And for humans, trying has always been enough to get started. As Zekthara prepared her final report for the Galactic Council, she struggled to find words that could convey the magnitude of what humanity represented. They were no longer simply another spacefaring species competing for resources and territory. They had become something unprecedented in galactic history, beings whose capabilities were limited only by their imagination, and whose imagination appeared to have no limits at all. The galaxy trembled at their name not because they were conquerors or destroyers, but because they were builders on a scale that made the old categories of power and civilization obsolete. They didn't seek to rule the cosmos. They sought to perfect it, and they were just getting started. In the years that followed, as humanity continued their work of transformation across the galaxy, other species would learn to see them not as threats to be feared or allies to be courted, but as gardeners tending to the infinite possibilities of existence itself. They had become the cosmos's answer to its own question about what intelligence could accomplish when freed from the limitations of scarcity, fear, and the need to compete for survival. Zekthara's final report would conclude with a simple statement that would echo through galactic history. Humanity advances into battle against the fundamental problems of existence itself. The cosmos trembles not in fear, but in anticipation of what they will accomplish next.